For over a century, one assumption about the Sumerians has gone almost completely unchallenged. When their cities fell, historians assumed their bloodline fell with them, swallowed by conquest, erased by empire, gone. But when scientists finally got usable DNA out of the ground in Mesopotamia, the story that came back wasn't the one anyone expected. It wasn't a story of disappearance at all. To understand why this discovery matters, you have to understand how strange the Sumerians already were before a single genome was sequenced. Around 4,500 BCE, in the marshlands of what's now southern Iraq, something happened that archaeologists still can't fully explain. Small farming villages along the Tigris and Euphrates didn't slowly evolve into cities over centuries. They exploded into them. Within a few hundred years, the region had city-states with populations in the tens of thousands, monumental temple complexes called ziggurats, formal legal systems, and, most strikingly, the world's first writing system, cuneiform, pressed into wet clay with a reed stylus. Uruk, one of these cities, is estimated to have held over 50,000 people by 2900 BCE, making it very likely the largest urban center on Earth at that time. What made the Sumerians even stranger to later scholars was their language. Sumerian is what linguists call a language isolate. It has no confirmed relatives, living or dead. Every other major language family on the planet, from Indo-European to Semitic to Sino-Tibetan, can be traced back to shared ancestral roots with other languages. Sumerian stands completely alone. For over 100 years, linguists have tried to connect it to Uralic languages, to Caucasian language families, to Dravidian tongues in India. None of the proposals have held up under scrutiny. That isolation fed a persistent theory that the Sumerians themselves were outsiders, a population that arrived in Mesopotamia from somewhere else, built something extraordinary, and then, when their political power collapsed under Akkadian and later Babylonian conquest around 2000 BCE, they simply vanished, culturally erased, and many assumed genetically erased too. That assumption sat largely untested for one simple reason. Getting usable ancient DNA out of Mesopotamian remains is brutally difficult. The region's extreme heat accelerates the breakdown of genetic material far faster than the cooler climates where most successful ancient DNA work, Neanderthal genomes, Bronze Age Europeans, had been done. For decades, researchers who wanted years as sequencing techniques improved dramatically. A landmark study published in the journal Science in 2022, led by researchers including Iosif Lazaridis and David Reich at Harvard, alongside colleagues at the University of Vienna, produced the first genome-wide ancient DNA data ever recovered from early Mesopotamian populations. It wasn't Sumerian remains specifically. It focused on the earlier pre-pottery and pottery Neolithic farmers of the region, but it did something crucial. It mapped, for the first time, the deep genetic landscape that Sumerian civilization would later rise out of. What the study found complicates the outsider theory before it even gets to the Sumerians themselves. The populations of this region weren't a single, isolated genetic pool waiting for a mysterious foreign group to arrive. They were already a blend, descended from a mixture between Anatolian-related, Caucasus-related, and Levantine hunter-gatherer populations, forming what the researchers described as a continuum of ancestry that mirrored the geography of West Asia itself. In other words, before Sumerian cities ever existed, the region was already a genetic crossroads, absorbing and mixing populations from multiple directions for thousands of years. That finding alone should have made scientists cautious about the idea of Sumerians as a single, sealed-off outsider bloodline. But the more direct test of the vanished without a trace theory came from a different angle entirely. Not from Sumerian burial sites, but from the people living in exactly the same marshlands today. In the wetlands of southern Iraq, where the Tigris and Euphrates spill into shallow marshes before reaching the Gulf, a population known as the Marsh Arabs, locally called the Madan, have lived for generations in a landscape almost untouched by time. Their reed-built homes, their flat-bottomed boats called tarada, their reliance on water buffalo and fishing, all echo descriptions found on Sumerian clay. Tablets thousands of years old. For a long time, this resemblance was treated as folklore, an evocative coincidence, nothing more. But it raised an obvious question. If the Sumerians really did vanish genetically, why would a population living in their exact homeland, practicing recognizably similar traditions, exist at all? Researchers at the University of Pavia in Italy decided to actually test it. In a study published through the National Center for Biotechnology Information, they surveyed Y chromosome and mitochondrial DNA, the genetic markers passed down the paternal and maternal lines, in 143 Marsh Arabs, comparing them against a broad sample of the wider Iraqi population. What they were looking for was simple. Does the population living in the ancient Sumerian heartland today carry a distinguishable genetic signature connecting it to the deep past, or has that signature been erased by thousands of years of conquest and migration? The results were not what the vanished population theory expansion. At a time period that lines up almost exactly with the Sumerian city-state era in southern Mesopotamia. That's a striking detail. It means the genetic patterns of male lineages in this specific region trace back, in a statistically identifiable way, to roughly the same window when Sumerian civilization was at its height. On top of that, the researchers identified an older, less common lineage called J1M26 Sunetust, which pointed toward a shared ancestral background with northern Mesopotamia, hinting at deeper connections, stretching even further back before the Sumerians rose to prominence. But here's where it gets genuinely interesting, and where the story stops being a simple confirmation and turns into something more complicated. The same study found that the overwhelming majority of the Marsh Arab gene pool, for both male and female lines, was best explained by autochthonous Middle Eastern ancestry, meaning ancestry that developed locally in place, rather than being imported from somewhere distant. There was only a weak secondary genetic signal linked to South Asia, and the researchers connected that specifically to the historical introduction of water buffalo, herding, and rice cultivation, technologies that likely arrived from the Indian subcontinent long after Sumerian civilization had already peaked. In plain terms, the population most closely tied to the ancient Sumerian homeland is, genetically, overwhelmingly local. Not a group of foreign colonizers whose bloodline mysteriously disappeared, not distant migrants from the Caucasus or Central Asia who left no trace, a population that has, in large part, simply always been there. That finding directly undercuts one of the oldest and most romantic theories about the Sumerians, the idea, echoed in some of their own religious texts describing a mysterious homeland called Dilmun, that they arrived from across the sea or descended from the mountains as total outsiders. The genetic evidence doesn't erase the mystery of Sumerian origins entirely, because the deep roots of West Asian populations do include real admixture from the Caucasus, the Zagros Mountains, and the Levant, stretching back many thousands of years before Sumerian cities existed. But it does dismantle the idea of a sudden, foreign, genetically distinct population parachuting into Mesopotamia around 4500 BCE and vanishing again 2,500 years later without leaving a trace. The traces were never actually missing. Scientists just hadn't looked for them the right way yet. This raises a much bigger question than the one the popular myth started with. If the Sumerians didn't disappear genetically, why did their language, their religion, and their political identity disappear so completely? Why does a population with a demonstrable genetic thread running into the present day leave behind a language that has no confirmed living relatives anywhere on Earth? The answer researchers are converging on has less to do with mass extinction or mysterious migration, and everything to do with something far more common in human history and far more interesting once you understand how it actually works. The difference between a people and their political identity, and how one can vanish from the historical record while the other quietly survives underneath it. To understand how a people can survive while their political and linguistic identity disappears, it helps to look at what actually happened when Akkadian power rose to dominance in Mesopotamia. Around 2334 BCE, Sargon of Akkad united the Asem region under a new empire, and the great independent Sumerian city-states, Uruk, Ur, Lagash, Nippur, lost their political sovereignty. But the historical record from that period, preserved on thousands of surviving clay tablets, tells a very different story than a story of conquest and erasure. Sargon and his successors didn't stamp out Sumerian culture, they absorbed it. Akkadian scribes kept training in Sumerian because Sumerian remained the language of religion, scholarship, and law for centuries after it stopped being anyone's native tongue. Temples continued honoring Sumerian gods. Legal and literary traditions were copied, translated, and preserved by Akkadian and later Babylonian scribes who treated Sumerian the way medieval European scholars treated Latin, a dead everyday language that stayed alive as the language of the educated and the sacred. This is a pattern linguists and historians recognize elsewhere in the ancient world, and it changes the entire meaning of what disappearance means for a civilization. A spoken native language can die out within a few generations, once a population stops using it for daily life. Children raised bilingual gradually favor the more practically useful language of trade, government, and neighbors, and within 2 or 3 generations, the ancestral tongue survives only in ritual or scholarly contexts, then eventually nowhere at all. That's very likely what happened to spoken Sumerian. As Akkadian, a Semitic language, became the practical language of daily life, administration, and trade across Mesopotamia, Sumerian speakers didn't need to disappear for their spoken language to die. They just needed to become bilingual, then have their grandchildren stop learning the ancestral half of that bilingualism. The clay tablets support this directly. Sumerian texts show substantial vocabulary borrowing from Semitic languages dating back to very early in Sumerian history, evidence that these populations were in close, sustained contact with Semitic speakers for a very long time before Sumerian ever went extinct as a spoken language. What this means is that the disappearance of Sumerian civilization was never really a disappearance of Sumerian people. It was a collapse of political sovereignty, followed by a gradual, multi-generational language shift layered on top of a population that appears, based on the genetic evidence, to have simply kept living, farming, and raising families in the same wetlands their ancestors always had. The empire changed. The language of power changed. The gods got new names in some cases and kept old ones in others. But the biological population underneath all of that political and cultural turnover shows real continuity, not replacement. This reframes one of the deepest assumptions in how archaeology used to interpret the ancient world. For most of the 20th century, researchers often treated dramatic shifts in material culture, new pottery styles, new architecture, new burial practices, as evidence that one population had physically replaced another. If the pots changed, the assumption went. So did the people. Ancient DNA has repeatedly complicated that assumption across multiple regions of the world, not just Mesopotamia. Populations can adopt a sweeping cultural change, new religions, new languages, new technologies, while remaining genetically continuous. Conversely, populations can migrate and genetically replace an area while local cultural practices persist through adoption and imitation. Culture and genetics, it turns out, don't always travel together, and assuming they do has led to more than a century of oversimplified stories about ancient population history. The Sumerian case is a particularly clean illustration of this, because it happens to be one of the best documented civilizations in the ancient world. Few other Bronze Age cultures left behind hundreds of thousands of written records describing their own religious beliefs, legal codes, and administrative details. That written record, combined with the genetic data now available from populations descended from the same region, lets researchers cross-check history against biology in a way that's rarely possible for civilizations this old. And what that cross-check reveals is a more grounded and in some ways more remarkable story than the myth of a vanished outsider people. It's a story about how thoroughly a political identity can be erased from a landscape while the human beings living in that landscape simply persist, adapt, and carry pieces of that ancient world forward without even realizing it. That raises the final and most human question in this entire investigation. If the descendants of one of history's first civilizations may still be living in the same marshes their ancestors settled 6,000 years ago, what does that actually mean for how we think about identity, heritage, and what disappearing really means for a people? That question isn't just philosophical. It has real, tangible consequences for how modern populations understand their own history. For centuries, the Marsh Arabs of southern Iraq were treated by outsiders, and sometimes even by their own neighbors, as a mysterious, disconnected group of unclear origin. Popular tradition in the region occasionally cast them as a foreign people, distinct from the wider population, based purely on their unusual way of life. The genetic research flips that narrative entirely. Rather than being outsiders, the Marsh Arabs appear to carry some of the deepest, most locally rooted ancestry in the entire region, a living biological thread stretching back toward the eras of Sumerian city-states. The people once assumed to be strangers may actually be among the closest living connections to one of the most consequential civilizations in human history. That doesn't mean every mystery about Sumerian origins has been solved. Researchers are still working to understand the deeper prehistory of the region, how populations from the Zagros Mountains, the Caucasus, and the Levant mixed together over thousands of years before Sumerian civilization ever emerged, and what specific combination of climate, agriculture, and social organization allowed city-states to form so suddenly. Around 4th 500 BCE, no one has fully explained why complex urban civilization appeared in this particular river delta before almost anywhere else on Earth. And the deep roots of the Sumerian language itself remain genuinely unresolved. Being a language isolate doesn't mean the people who spoke it were biological outsiders. Language and genetics can diverge completely. But it does mean linguists still don't know what earlier language, if any, Sumerian descended from, or what happened to any relatives it might once have had. What has changed is the shape of the mystery. The old version of this story asked, where did the Sumerians go and why did they leave no genetic trace? That question, it turns out, was built on a flawed premise. The evidence increasingly suggests the better question is, how did a civilization's language, religion, and political identity manage to vanish so completely from a landscape where the people themselves largely stayed put? That's a different kind of mystery, but arguably a richer one, because it's not really a story about disappearance at all. It's a story about transformation, about how thoroughly the visible markers of a civilization Its writing, its gods, its cities, its political power can be erased or absorbed by history, while the human continuity underneath quietly persists for thousands of years, invisible until scientists finally had the tools to look for it. There's something worth sitting with in that. We tend to think of great ancient civilizations the way we think of endangered species. Either they survive or they go extinct, with nothing in between. But the Sumerian case and the growing body of ancient DNA research across other regions of the world suggests reality is far messier and far more human than that. Civilizations fall in ways that are visible and dramatic. Cities get conquered, temples fall silent, languages stop being spoken, written records stop being produced. But the populations underneath those civilizations often don't fall at all. They adapt, intermarry, adopt new rulers and new gods and new languages, and carry on generation after generation in the same rivers and the same fields their ancestors farmed. The empire changes hands. The people remain. This has implications that reach well beyond Mesopotamia. As ancient DNA sequencing technology continues to improve, and as researchers gain access to more remains from more archaeological sites across the Near East, similar reassessments are likely for other civilizations, whose disappearance has long been treated as total. The techniques used to trace Sumerian-era ancestry in the Marsh Arabs, comparing modern regional populations against the deep genetic architecture mapped out by projects like the 2022 Harvard-led study on Mesopotamian and Anatolian ancestry, are becoming more precise and more widely applied every year. Every new genome recovered from an ancient burial site adds another data point to a picture that's still very much being filled in. For now, what the science actually tells us is this: the Sumerians did not vanish. Their empire did. Their spoken language did. Their independent city-states, their priest-kings, their formal religious hierarchy, all of it collapsed under the weight of conquest and centuries of political change. Degrees appear to have simply kept living in the same wetlands where their civilization first rose, absorbing new rulers and new languages the way every long-lived population eventually does. Their tablets called it disappearance. The DNA suggests something closer to survival. If you found this as fascinating as I did piecing it together, I'd genuinely like to know what you think this means for how we treat other lost civilizations. Whether the same kind of hidden continuity might be waiting to be found in populations we've long assumed simply vanished. Drop your thoughts in the comments, and if you want more research-driven investigations like this one, subscribing helps a lot.